August 15th, 1944. The calm Mediterranean waters explode with thunder. Warships unleash a storm of fire as paratroopers descend from the night sky. Thousands of Allied soldiers race toward the southern coast of France. Yet, this invasion, codenamed Operation Dragoon, would fade into the shadows of history, overshadowed by the fame of Normandy. But what really happened here? And why did the world forget? Hello and welcome back to Forgotten WW2 Archives, where we uncover the untold battles, the overlooked heroes, and the moments that shaped history but slipped from memory. Today, we're diving deep into the forgotten invasion of southern France, Operation Dragoon. Sit tight, because this story is one of strategy, secrecy, and redemption. By the summer of 1944, Europe was burning. Just 2 months earlier, Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy in Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious invasion in history. The world watched in awe as American, British, and Canadian troops fought their way inland through France's northern coast. But while all eyes were fixed on Normandy, another invasion was quietly brewing in the south, one that would prove equally vital in crushing Hitler's hold on Europe. Originally, Operation Dragoon wasn't even supposed to happen. In fact, it began as Operation Anvil, a plan to land in southern France at the same time as Normandy. But limited landing craft, conflicting opinions among Allied leaders, and fierce debate in high command delayed it. Winston Churchill strongly opposed the idea, believing that attacking through the Balkans would be more strategic, cutting off the Germans in Eastern Europe and preventing Soviet expansion. But the Americans, led by General Dwight D. Eisenhower, argued that southern France was the key to victory. It would secure vital ports, relieve pressure on northern forces, and open a new front to crush the retreating Wehrmacht. Eventually, Eisenhower's plan won out. The target, the stunning, sun-soaked coastline of southern France, stretching from Toulon to Cannes. This region was part of what the Germans called Festung Frankreich, Fortress France. It was heavily fortified, but not as fiercely defended as Normandy. The German 19th Army, under General Friedrich Wyss, held the line, though it was weakened and stretched thin after transferring divisions north to face the Normandy landings. Still, the beaches were mined, artillery positions were hidden in cliffs, and machine gun nests dotted the coastline. Preparation began in secret. The invasion fleet was immense, over 880 ships, carrying more than 450 Zero men. It included American, British, Canadian, and Free French forces, along with naval support from across the Allied world. Airborne units from the U.S. 1st Airborne Task Force were trained to drop behind enemy lines to disrupt communications and secure key roads. Resistance fighters, members of the French Maquis, prepared sabotage operations deep in the hills. On the eve of the invasion, Allied pilots flew endless bombing raids to soften the defenses. The night before D-Day, August 15th, the southern sky shimmered with tracer fire and explosions. Paratroopers boarded their aircraft, faces grim, hearts pounding. Below them, the Mediterranean waves shimmered silver in the moonlight. For many, this would be their first and last mission. As dawn broke over the Riviera, the roar of naval bombardment echoed for miles. Warships unleashed their fury upon German strongholds. It was one of the most intense bombardments of the war in southern Europe. The sea turned red and black with smoke. Amphibious craft surged toward the beaches' Alpha, Delta, and Camel sectors. American troops of the 3rd, 36th, and 45th Infantry Divisions hit the shores with determination. The initial resistance was surprisingly light. The German defenders, under constant bombardment and disoriented by airborne attacks, were unprepared for the full scale of the assault. Within hours, beachheads were secured. Towns like Saint-Tropez and Saint-Raphael fell rapidly. The French Riviera, once a symbol of luxury and beauty, was now a battlefield of liberation. Inland chaos reigned. The paratroopers of the U.S. 1st Airborne Task Force, scattered by strong winds, regrouped in small units. Despite confusion, they ambushed German convoys, seized bridges, and blocked roads to prevent reinforcements. The French resistance, who had been waiting for this moment, launched uprisings all across the region. They sabotaged train lines, ambushed supply columns, and guided Allied troops through mountain passes. For the people of southern France, long under occupation, the invasion was more than a military operation, it was the rebirth of freedom. But while success seemed swift, political tension still brewed behind the scenes. Charles de Gaulle, leader of Free France, was determined that French troops would play a central role. He wanted French forces to liberate their own soil, especially key cities like Toulon and Marseille. And so, French Roman II Corps under General Jean de Lattre de Tassigny joined the advance. Their mission, retake the ports, vital for supplying the entire Allied campaign in Europe. By August 16th, Allied troops were pushing rapidly northward. German command was collapsing under the weight of two invasions: Normandy in the north, Dragoon in the south. Hitler's once formidable armies were caught in a vice. The 19th Army, realizing its danger, began retreating through the Rhone Valley. But the Allies were closing fast. From the decks of Allied ships, soldiers gazed at the burning coastline. Smoke rose from destroyed batteries and shattered bunkers. The tricolor flag of France fluttered once again over liberated towns. In the villages, people wept and cheered as convoys rolled through. Children ran beside the tanks, waving makeshift flags. After years of darkness, light was returning to southern France. But as the dust settled on the beaches of Provence, one question lingered: why was this massive and successful operation forgotten by history? Why did the world remember Normandy, but not Dragoon? The answer lies not just in strategy, but in politics, pride, and propaganda. The invasion of southern France had begun with thunder and fire, but what followed was a lightning advance that shocked even the Allies themselves. Within hours of landing, troops were pushing inland faster than anyone had anticipated. Operation Dragoon had turned from a risky gamble into one of the most successful amphibious assaults of World War II. As dawn turned into day, the scale of Allied coordination became clear. American, British, and French forces moved with precision, supported by waves of bombers and naval gunfire. Overhead, Allied aircraft maintained near-total air superiority, cutting off German reinforcements and attacking every convoy that dared to move. On the ground, paratroopers and French resistance fighters worked hand in hand, striking at communication lines and ambushing retreating columns. By the second day, the German 19th Army was in disarray. General Wyss's troops, spread thin and battered, were ordered by Hitler to stand and die, but they had little left to stand with. Many German units were made up of older soldiers, Eastern European conscripts, and exhausted survivors pulled from Italy. Their morale was crumbling. The Allies, by contrast, were fresh, determined, and supported by overwhelming firepower. Commanding the entire operation was General Alexander Patch of the U.S. 7th Army. Beneath him were three main divisions leading the assault: the 3rd Infantry, the 36th Texas Division, and the 45th Thunderbird Division. Their orders were simple yet ambitious: secure the beachhead, capture the ports, and drive north to link up with the forces advancing from Normandy. To the east, General Lucien Truscott, a brilliant and aggressive commander, directed the 3rd Division toward the key town of Draguignan, a critical communications hub for the Germans. Despite tough resistance, the Americans advanced rapidly, capturing the town by August 17th. Meanwhile, the 36th Division fought through rugged terrain and stubborn enemy pockets, clearing villages one by one. But it was the French Roman II Corps, under General de Latter de Tassigny, that carried the weight of national pride. Their task was to liberate Toulon and Marseille, two of France's most vital ports. The Germans had fortified both cities heavily, determined to destroy them before surrendering. The French knew this was not just a military mission, but a symbolic one. After 4 years of occupation, French soldiers were returning home to reclaim their own soil. On August 19th, French troops began their assault on Toulon. Street by street, building by building, they fought their way through fierce German defenses. The resistance was desperate. Machine guns rattled through the narrow streets, and artillery pounded the harbor. French Marines, tanks, and commandos pushed relentlessly forward. The civilians, hiding in cellars, could hear the battle closing in. By August 27th, after 8 days of brutal urban warfare, Toulon was free. Over 17,000 German soldiers were captured. Immediately after, the French turned their attention to Marseille. It was even more crucial, not only for morale but for logistics. The entire Allied campaign in France depended on opening that harbor. Without it, supply lines from Normandy were stretched to breaking. French forces launched a massive assault from 3 directions. Local resistance groups rose in support, attacking German positions inside the city. For the first time, civilians and soldiers fought side by side. The liberation of Marseille was nothing short of extraordinary. The people poured into the streets as the tricolor flag once again flew above the city. General de Latter, overcome with emotion, saluted his men and declared, "France has returned to France." It was a moment of deep pride, a signal that the soul of the nation had survived. The victory was not without sacrifice. The fighting was fierce, and both sides suffered heavy casualties. But in just 12 days, the Allies had captured both Toulon and Marseille far ahead of schedule. With the ports secured, Operation Dragoon became a logistical triumph. Within weeks, Marseille was fully operational, unloading more supplies than any port in northern France. Food, fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements poured in through the harbor, feeding the Allied war machine. This single achievement shortened the war in Europe by months. Eisenhower later admitted that the success of Dragoon was far greater than he had expected and perhaps more decisive than anyone realized. Meanwhile, the ground forces continued their rapid advance northward through the Rhone Valley. The German retreat turned into a rout. Allied bombers shredded columns of trucks and tanks along the narrow roads. Bridges were blown, convoys burned, and prisoners marched by the thousands. Entire German divisions were annihilated before they could regroup. And yet, despite its success, the soldiers who fought here would find little recognition. History would remember the beaches of Normandy, the heroism of D-Day, and the liberation of Paris, but not the blood and courage spilled along the sun-drenched coast of Provence. For many veterans, this was a quiet wound. They had fought just as fiercely, sacrificed just as much, but their story was lost in the noise of greater headlines. Still, on the ground, they pressed on. The U.S. 7th Army advanced north through Lyon, while the French forces moved east toward the Alps. The Germans, now in full retreat, struggled to establish new defensive lines along the Vosges Mountains. Operation Dragoon had succeeded beyond expectation, but the war in France was not yet over. Ahead lay some of the toughest terrain and fiercest resistance of the campaign. Picture the scene: endless convoys of Allied trucks rumbling up narrow mountain roads, Sherman tanks grinding through pine forests, and fighter planes roaring overhead. Villagers lined the roads, waving and throwing flowers to the soldiers who passed. Liberation had come, but the smell of smoke and death still lingered in the air. Stout German vehicles littered the highways. Every mile brought new discoveries, camps abandoned, prisoners freed, and stories of suffering uncovered. By early September 1944, the forces of Operation Dragoon had linked up with those advancing from Normandy near Dijon. The southern and northern fronts of France had finally joined, cutting off the German armies still trapped in the west. What began as a debated, nearly cancelled invasion had turned into one of the most strategically significant victories of the entire war. And yet, despite its success, Operation Dragoon would fade quietly into the background of history books. Political disputes between Churchill and Eisenhower, the overwhelming fame of Normandy, and post-war propaganda meant that the men who fought in southern France were rarely mentioned. But for those who were there for the Americans, the French, the British, and the countless resistance fighters, it would remain a proud and unforgettable chapter in their lives. As the Allies marched north toward Germany, the tide of war had fully turned. Hitler's empire was collapsing from within, but even as victory seemed within reach, darker truths were beginning to surface: the destruction left behind, the civilians caught in between, and the cost of liberation itself. The summer of 1944 was ending, but for the soldiers who had fought in southern France, the campaign was far from over. Operation Dragoon had achieved its immediate goals with stunning speed. The beaches were secure, the ports of Toulon and Marseille had been liberated, and the German 19th Army was in full retreat. Yet the road ahead wound into mountains, rivers, and valleys soaked in danger. The Allies were now racing not just against the enemy, but against time itself. As the 7th Army pushed north, the once beautiful countryside of Provence transformed into a battlefield of pursuit. The Rhône Valley became a corridor of smoke and ruin. Allied aircraft strafed fleeing convoys, artillery rumbled day and night, and columns of prisoners marched toward improvised camps under a burning sun. Each small village liberated revealed a new story of occupation, resistance, and revenge. The locals welcomed their liberators with tears and cheers, but behind the celebrations lay scars that would take years to heal. The German retreat turned chaotic. Many soldiers abandoned their vehicles and fled on foot through forests and hills. Bridges were blown to slow the Allied advance, but nothing could stop the relentless push northward. Within just 2 weeks, the Allies had advanced over 400 kilometers, one of the fastest advances of the war in Western Europe. It was a feat of coordination and determination that stunned even their commanders. For the men on the ground, victory was measured not in territory, but in survival. The heat, the dust, and the constant fatigue tested every soldier. Many had landed in the early hours of August 15th, and had not slept properly since. Letters from home were scarce, and the faces of fallen comrades haunted their dreams. But among them, a quiet pride began to grow. They were part of something few would ever know, a campaign that truly turned the tide of the war, even if history chose to forget it. By early September, Allied forces from Operation Dragoon had linked with those from Normandy near Dijon. It was a moment of triumph, a meeting of two great armies that now spanned the entire breadth of France. The liberation of the nation was nearly complete. German forces trapped between the two fronts had no choice but to surrender or flee east toward the German border. In just 1 month, southern France had been freed. More than 100,000 German troops were killed, wounded, or captured. 2 major ports were opened, and vast stretches of territory returned to French control. The success was absolute. And yet, when history books were written, Operation Dragoon became little more than a footnote, overshadowed by the glory of Normandy and the race to Paris. So why was Operation Dragoon forgotten? The answer lies not on the battlefield, but in the corridors of power. From the beginning, the invasion was mired in political tension. Winston Churchill had opposed it fiercely, arguing that it diverted vital resources from the Balkans and Italy. He wanted to strike at the soft underbelly of Europe and block Soviet expansion into Eastern Europe. But Eisenhower and the American High Command insisted that southern France was essential both for logistics and strategy. After the war, Churchill's influence and writings shaped much of the public narrative in the West. Normandy became the great symbol of Allied unity and courage, while Dragoon was quietly overlooked. Even in France, the liberation of Paris captured the world's imagination, leaving little room for the victories of Marseille or Toulon. The men who fought in the South were heroes, but their battlefield had been eclipsed by politics, publicity, and timing. In the months that followed, Marseille became the beating heart of the Allied supply network. By winter 1944, it was unloading more cargo than any other port in Europe. Every bullet fired in northern France, every ration delivered to troops pushing into Germany, likely passed through those docks. Operation Dragoon had not just liberated land, it had built the foundation for victory, but the cost was steep. Over 17,000 Allied soldiers were killed or wounded. Entire French towns were reduced to rubble. The people of southern France emerged from 4 years of Nazi occupation to find their homes destroyed, their families scattered, and as Allied armies moved north, they uncovered the horrors of German retreat massacres, reprisals, and the grim realities of war. For the soldiers who fought in Operation Dragoon, the end of the war brought little recognition. When medals were handed out and parades were held, most of the world's attention was elsewhere, on Paris, on Berlin, on the beaches of Normandy. Many veterans of Dragoon would later say that they felt invisible in history, their stories left untold. But in their silence, they carried something deeper, the quiet knowledge that their courage had shortened the war and saved countless lives. Some historians argue that without Dragoon, the liberation of France might have stalled. The ports of Normandy were too small to sustain the massive Allied advance. Supplies were dwindling by August. It was Marseille and Toulon captured in record time that kept the armies moving. Without them, the push into Germany might have taken far longer. Today, along the beaches of Provence, traces of the invasion still remain. Concrete bunkers crumble under wildflowers. Rusted barbed wire lies buried in sand. In small villages, plaques and monuments quietly commemorate the men who landed there in 1944. The sea that once boiled with gunfire now sparkles peacefully under the Mediterranean sun. Tourists stroll where soldiers once fought and died, unaware that this coast witnessed one of the most brilliant and overlooked victories of the war. Operation Dragoon was more than an invasion. It was the story of redemption for a France yearning to stand free, for Allied soldiers eager to prove their might once again, and for a world inching closer to peace. It showed that even in the shadows of great events, courage burns just as brightly. The soldiers who fought here didn't need fame. Their victory lived on in the freedom they restored. In the end, Dragoon's true legacy lies not in the history books, but in the lives it saved and the nations it rebuilt. The men who stormed those southern beaches helped crack open Hitler's fortress from below, forcing the German army into retreat and accelerating the liberation of Europe. Their story may have been forgotten by many, but not by history itself, and not by us. And that's the story of Operation Dragoon, the forgotten invasion of southern France, a chapter of World War II that deserves to be remembered alongside Normandy and the great battles of Europe. If you enjoyed this deep dive into a lost piece of history, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video to keep the memory of these heroes alive. This is Forgotten WW2 Archives, where we bring light to the stories the world left behind.